All right, now we're going to talk about David Hume. David Hume was also an empiricist, like Locke, but he ended up at a very wildly different conclusion. So David Hume was generally skeptical that we had knowledge of many of the common sense things we think we have knowledge of. Now, this is interesting because Hume and Locke started with much the same starting point. So Hume says we start with impressions. These are very similar to just perceptions, right? So we get impressions from the external world. The external world acts on us, and through our sense organs, impresses uh, perceptions or images or smells or tastes, whatever it is. It impresses these things upon our minds. And these impressions we get are very vivid, right? Because it's our initial perception of these things, but however, they are very fleeting, right? So our impressions come in and then they've passed away almost as quickly. So what do we have left? Because we can't keep all of these impressions. What we have are ideas, and for Hume, ideas are simply copies of impressions. So ideas are things that we can take that last, and they last a long time. But the only downside is they're less vivid than the initial impression we once had. So initially, think of it as, the paper you sign, which has multiple layers, each which carry through. So when you sign on these papers, you sign on the top page, and your signature bleeds through to the other pages. But if you have a stack thick enough, your signature on the first page will be very vivid. But your signature on the very bottom page will be maybe a little smudged or maybe missing some little pieces or faint in other areas, so it's less vivid. And so that's the difference between impressions and ideas, right? Impressions go away almost immediately, but they're very vivid, and ideas stick with us, but they're less vivid. And so this is basically the same thing as Locke's notion of simple ideas. It's just the raw material we get from perception. But Hume also has something very similar to Locke's notion of complex ideas. We're not going to go too into detail because it's so similar, but roughly Hume thinks we can just take the ideas we get from our impressions, and then we can use our mind to form different ideas that we didn't get a direct impression of. Right? So clearly he has to explain how we have ideas of fictional things. So to use our classic example of the unicorn again, clearly we have ideas of unicorns, but it's also clear that we've never gotten an impression of a unicorn. Right? So how do we explain this idea? Well, we've gotten an impression of a horse and a horn and whiteness and so on and so forth, and then our mind can take all of those, put them together, take all of those impressions and ideas, put them together to form this new idea of a unicorn. Now, why is this important? Well, Hume's going to take this empiricism and see if many of the scientific and philosophical terms we think are important could actually come about through this empirical process, this empiricist process. So for Hume, if you want to check whether something is meaningful or not, all you need to do is trace it back to the impression that it came from. Right, so with the unicorn, we can trace that back, and the term unicorn is meaningful because we can trace it back to our impressions of whiteness, horse, horn, etc. Right? But he's going to say there's some things that when we try and trace it back, we realize there is no impression for it. We've just made this thing up. And so it's not a meaningful idea that we have. It might actually be nonsense. And so now he's going to look at some important things from philosophy and science. Right? So let's slowly go through all the things Hume is skeptical of based on his empiricism. And the first is the notion of causality. So obviously causality is extremely important for philosophy, science, and just the seeming operation of our day-to-day lives, right? So we have these notions of causality. And what is causality? Well, it's this idea that there's a necessary connection between two events. There's a special relationship between two events. Right? We think not just that y follows x sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't. No, we think y always follows x, and that's because x causes y to occur. So, what's a good example of this? Well, you turn the key in the ignition of your car, and that causes your engine to start, right? It causes your car to start. Excuse me. So, we think that the turning of the key actually causes the vehicle to start. We don't think that we could turn the key and the car would just float into the air, turn the key and the car would explode. Although there will be cases, as we've seen in movies, where that does occur. That's because something's been tampered with, right? So here we think that X actually causes Y, and anytime Y doesn't happen, it's because we don't actually have all of the same conditions. Instead of X, say we have Z, where somebody's put some C4 on the bottom of the car. That's a different thing, right? But in normal conditions, if everything stays the same, we know turning the key will always cause the car to start. And so we have this idea that there's a necessary connection between events, right? Causation is very important, not for just our daily lives, but that's mostly what science is trying to figure out, right? How do the laws of nature relate to one another so that one action can cause another? And that's how we get our predictive power from the sciences. But Hume wants to ask, where do we get this impression of the necessary connection between two events? Where do we get this impression of causality from? And here Hume uses the billiards example. There we go. So imagine you're playing pool or billiards and you strike the cue ball and it hits the 4. Hume's going to claim that you can't possibly know what's going to occur, right? So you looked at the comic above where it showed people Hume dropping a ball off of a tower, and they ask, well, what's going to happen every time? And Hume says, well, you never know what's going to happen. It could fall, as it does in the comic, or something else could happen. It's no proof that it's happened before that it's going to happen again. And this is because Hume thinks all we're seeing is a constant conjunction of one event followed by another. But we don't actually see or get an impression of the necessary connection. So really what's happening is we see A, we see B. We see A, we see B. We see A, we see B. But we never actually see the thing that connects A and B. So imagine the billiards example again. You strike the cue ball, it's going toward the 4 to hit the 4. And what happens? Well, it goes in the direction you planned on. Okay, so you do it again. You set up the same experiment. Strike the cue ball, hits the 4, it moves again. Now you've seen A and B occur a couple times. But Hume's going to say you never actually got an impression of the necessary connection. So what's happening now is that you're missing the important impression we need for the term causality to have any meaning. Right? So, I mean, it's hard to really describe here, but when you see the cue ball strike the 4, do you ever actually see causality, or do you just see one event followed by another? Well, clearly we don't see the causality. So if Hume's right about that, then really what we're just seeing is the constant conjunction of two events, not actually the causality of the event. So, sorry about that. Alright, I apologize. I had the window open and the neighbor's dog started going crazy. So hopefully I can keep my train of thought here clear for you guys. Roughly, using any example of causation you want, doesn't have to be the billiards example. We're never actually going to see the necessary connection or the causation. We're just going to see two events followed one by the other. And so if this is true and we can't actually find the impression, then Hume's going to say causation doesn't actually have any meaning. He's not saying causation doesn't exist. It might exist. Hume's just saying we can't be justified in believing it exists. We don't have the proper evidence given his empiricism. So it's just a useful fiction for us in the sciences. The next thing he thinks we can't have rational evidence of is the external world. So we think this external world exists. We think we're moving around in this physical external world. However, all of our evidence for the external world comes from our impressions. Unfortunately for us, impressions and ideas are these purely subjective mental objects, right? So it's clear that when we have an impression or an idea, that's something we have that's a mental picture, right? So when I have an idea of something, it's this mental picture. When I'm getting an impression of the world, I'm getting this mental stuff, this mental material to work with. But the external world is by definition a physical object. So it turns out we never actually get the right type of evidence for believing in a physical world. We would need physical evidence, but all we can get is mental evidence, because all we have is impressions and ideas that come from our impressions. So we actually don't have any evidence that an external world exists, because we can't have the right type of physical evidence. All we can have is mental evidence. So notice again, his empiricism is pretty radical. It's showing that we can't believe in a lot of things we thought we could believe in. The final victim, although he doubts many other things, the final one we're going to talk about is the idea of the self. So, I mean, it's just sort of common intuition that we all think we're the same person that persists over time, right? We have a self, concept of self. We have a personal identity. When we went to sleep tonight, yesterday, or will go to sleep tonight, we think we wake up the same person in the morning. But once again, Hume's going to say, where did you get this impression from? Right? When we think of ourselves, right? So think of yourself right now. There's no set impression that you're going to go to. Think of yourself again. Wait 10 minutes and think of yourself again. There's not going to be a set impression that you go to, right? So you're going to think of maybe a memory you have, a particular experience, or you're going to think of a quality you might have, so on and so forth, right? You're always going to appeal to some impression. But this isn't enough. It's not enough to just recall certain perceptions or impressions we have had. We need to have an impression of the self. And this we just never get. So think of every time you try and think of the self, you're just going to think of some perception, or you're going to picture yourself acting in the world. But you don't actually get a particular impression of the self. You're just getting a memory of this various collection of impressions you've had. But these are all going to be impressions of other things, or you moving or thinking in the world. It's not actually an impression of this idea of the self. Right? There's not something common to every set of perceptions that we can call the self. So when we have a thought of ourselves at 6 and a thought of ourselves today, what part of your perception in each of those is the self? Right? Well, you have a lot of perceptions of yourself when you're 6. You can picture your smaller body. Maybe many of your features look young or undeveloped. Maybe your hair has a different cut or color, and that's changed over time. Where's the self, right? We just listed a bunch of sense perceptions about an object, about the person, but we didn't actually point out where the self is. And that's important because if we can't point out where the self is in that one, it's definitely going to be hard to point to the same thing in both the set of perceptions describing ourselves at 6 and the set of perceptions describing ourselves now. So it seems like we're pretty lost, right? Hume's taken away a lot from us. But really, we just need to be clear. Hume's not claiming that causality, the external world, and ourselves don't exist. They may exist, they might not. What he's saying is that we just don't have any proof that they exist, so it's irrational to believe in them. So now you've seen how, from Hume's empiricism, he starts in the same place as Locke and ends up somewhere wildly different and skeptic. And that's the end of empiricism for this week. Thank you.